On a windless beach in eastern Greece, 1,000 warships sit motionless in the shallows, their sails hanging slack, their crews restless and hungry, and at the head of that great army, beside a rough stone altar above the bay, a king is preparing to do something no father should ever be asked to do. The girl standing before him wears a wedding dress. She came to this beach believing she was about to marry the greatest warrior in Greece, and she was wrong. No bridegroom is waiting at Aulis. Waiting instead are a seer, a silent goddess, and a price that must be paid before the wind will ever blow again, and the price is her. How does a king, a husband, a father arrive at a moment like this? What could possibly persuade a man to trade his own daughter for a favorable wind? That is the story you'll hear tonight, the fleet that could not sail, the terrible bargain a seer laid before the most powerful king in Greece, the lie that lured a girl and her proud mother to a waiting altar, and the astonishing thing the goddess Artemis did at the very last instant, in the version the oldest sources tell. If you enjoy these stories, take a moment to subscribe. It truly helps this channel, and tell me in the comments which myth you'd like next. Now settle in, and let's go back to the beginning, to a crowded harbor where the whole Trojan War was waiting on the weather. The story begins with an oath and an insult. Helen, queen of Sparta and the most beautiful woman in the world, had been carried off to Troy by a prince named Paris, and every king in Greece who had once sworn to defend her marriage was now called to fight for her return. At the head of them all stood her husband's brother, Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, the most powerful ruler in Greece, a proud and ambitious man who saw in this war his chance to command the greatest army the world had ever seen. From every corner of the land, the ships came, gathering in the sheltered bay of Aulis on the eastern coast. 1,000 black hulls drawn up on the sand, tens of thousands of men camped on the dry hills above them, all of them waiting for one simple thing: a wind for Troy. And the wind would not come. Day after day, the sea lay flat as poured bronze, or the breeze blew hard and contrary, straight into their faces, pinning the fleet against its own shore. Days became weeks. The food ran short, sickness crept through the tents, and the restless army began to grumble, then to quarrel, then to mutter about abandoning the war entirely and going home. Agamemnon stood on the beach and watched the great moment of his life rotting in front of him. Something, the men whispered around their fires, was wrong with this stillness. This was no ordinary weather. Someone in the camp had angered a god. In desperation, Agamemnon summoned Calchas, the most famous seer in Greece, a man who could read the will of the gods in the flight of birds and the smoke of burnt offerings. What Calchas found when he searched for the cause of the dead calm made him afraid to speak. The offended god was Artemis, the untamed goddess of the wild places, protector of animals and of young girls, and the man who had offended her was Agamemnon himself. The old stories say the king had killed a deer in a grove sacred to the goddess, and then, flushed with the shot, had boasted aloud that Artemis herself could not have done better. It was a small moment, a hunter's careless bragging on a good day, but the gods have never measured insults by their size. Artemis had stilled the winds, and she would hold that fleet on the beach until it starved, unless her price was paid. When the king demanded to know what the price was, Calchas refused to say it in front of the army. The words he finally spoke, to Agamemnon and a handful of others alone, were these: the goddess required the king's own eldest daughter, Iphigenia, offered to her upon the altar at Aulis. Nothing less would raise the wind, and nothing else would be accepted in her place. Agamemnon wept and raged and swore he would sooner send the whole army home. But a prophecy is a hard thing to bury, and this one had already begun to spread from fire to fire through the camp. What followed was a war inside one man. As a father, Agamemnon knew there was nothing to discuss, because no wind, no war, and no glory could be worth his daughter's life. But he was not only a father. He was the commander of a vast army that had left its homes and harvests on his word, the brother of the wronged husband, the king whose name would carry either the glory of this war or the shame of its collapse. His brother Menelaus pressed him. The hungry, mutinous army pressed him harder. And slowly, terribly, the king began to bend where the father should have stood firm. A letter went out from Aulis to his queen, Clytemnestra, far away in Mycenae, and the letter was a lie. "Send Iphigenia to the camp at once," it said, "for the great Achilles, swiftest and most glorious of all the warriors of Greece, has asked to marry her before the fleet sails, and such a match cannot be allowed to wait." It was a lure built out of a mother's pride and a young girl's hope, and it worked perfectly. The old poets say that Agamemnon's nerve broke in the night, that he wrote a second letter canceling the first and begging his family to stay away, and that the second letter was intercepted and destroyed before it ever left the camp. Whatever the truth of that, the outcome was the same. Far away in Mycenae, a royal household erupted into joy and began packing for a wedding. Clytemnestra arrived at Aulis in the full splendor of a queen delivering a bride. She came in a decorated chariot with attendants and wedding gifts, her baby son Orestes in her arms, and beside her rode Iphigenia, young, bright with excitement, dressed in her finest clothes, coming to marry the most celebrated hero of the age. The camp turned out to watch them pass, that vast army of men, most of whom knew by now exactly what the girl had really been summoned for. The soldiers looked at the wedding gifts and looked at the ground and said nothing. Iphigenia sprang down from the chariot and ran to her father and threw her arms around a man who could barely bring himself to look at her. The old poets linger on this scene, and it is easy to understand why, because its cruelty needs no violence at all. A daughter chattering happily about her wedding to a father who knows there is no wedding. A proud mother asking after the arrangements, the feast, the bridegroom's family, while the king answers in short, strangled phrases and turns his face away to weep where they cannot see. Even Achilles knew nothing. His name had been borrowed for the trap without his consent, and when the beaming queen greeted him as her future son-in-law, the confusion between them tore the whole lie open. An old servant confessed the truth of the letter, and the woman who had come to Aulis as the mother of a bride now stood in a war camp as the mother of a sacrifice. What happened next, the old playwright staged so powerfully that it has never been forgotten. Clytemnestra confronted her husband with the truth and begged him, as his wife and the mother of his children, to spare their daughter. Iphigenia begged too. She had been the first child ever to call him father, she reminded him, the little girl he had once carried on his shoulders. She asked only to live, because the light of day is sweet, and nothing beneath the earth is worth trading it for. Achilles, furious that his name had been used to bait the trap, swore he would defend the girl with his own body if he had to. But the army had learned what the goddess demanded, and countless men who wanted their war turned as one against anyone who stood in its way. Even Achilles, the best of them all, was shouted down by his own soldiers when he tried. The trap had closed on every one of them, the king included. And then, in the strangest and most moving turn of the whole story, it was Iphigenia herself who ended it. Seeing that her death had become certain, she chose to stop running from it. She would go to the altar willingly, she announced, not dragged, not weeping, but walking of her own accord as a gift for Greece. And if her life was truly the price of the wind, then let no man of the army carry the guilt of forcing her. The girl they had lured with a false wedding walked out of that tent with more courage than the entire army waiting outside it. They led her up from the camp in a slow procession, dressed as a bride after all, with garlands in her hair, past the 1,000 motionless ships and the silent, shame-faced army, to the stone altar of Artemis on the headland above the bay. Her mother did not follow. Clytemnestra stayed below among the tents, holding the baby Orestes, unable to watch what her husband had agreed to. At the altar, the priest scattered the sacred barley and lifted the ritual blade, and Agamemnon, the old accounts say, drew his cloak across his face, unable to look upon what his own choices had led to. The whole shore of Aulis seemed to hold its breath along with the windless air. Iphigenia asked the men around her not to mourn and closed her eyes. The blade rose. And here, every telling of the story agrees on one strange detail. At the final instant, the men gathered on that hillside looked away, all of them at once, so that no human eye saw exactly what happened next. There came a sound and a sudden brightness like sun breaking through sea mist, and when the priests and the kings turned back to the altar, they froze where they stood. Lying on the stone, in the place where the girl had been, was a deer, a wild mountain deer, its life given to the goddess in her place. Of Iphigenia herself, there was no sign at all. The garlands lay scattered on the grass, and the girl was simply gone. This is the part of the story that the oldest sources insist upon, poems older than the famous tragedies, reaching back almost to the beginning of the Trojan War tradition itself. Artemis had never wanted the girl's death. At the last instant, the goddess had swept Iphigenia from the altar, hidden her in a fold of cloud and sea mist, and set the deer upon the stone in her place, and then she carried the girl away across the open water, far to the north, to the wild land of the Taurians on the cold shore of the Black Sea. There, Iphigenia lived on, made priestess of Artemis's own temple, serving the goddess who had saved her, keeping the sacred fire on a stone terrace above gray water at the very edge of the known world, alive, honored, and unimaginably far from home. Back at Aulis, the men chose to read the deer as both mercy and acceptance. The goddess was satisfied. Even as the smoke of the offering climbed into the air, the weather turned. The flat sea shivered, the slack sails filled, and a clean, strong wind came pouring down the strait toward Troy at last. On the next tide, the great fleet that her life had ransomed rode out of the bay, and the 10-year war that would make all their names immortal finally began. Clytemnestra never saw the deer, and would not have been comforted by it. She had come to that beach with a bride and a nursing baby, and she sailed home to Mycenae with only the baby in her arms. It would be comforting to call this a story with a happy ending, and in one sense it is. The blade never touched her. The goddess proved kinder than the king, and far away in the north, a girl the army mourned as dead was alive, keeping a temple above the sea. Yet the old poets understood something that the miracle at the altar cannot wash away. Artemis saved Iphigenia. Nothing saved the family. A father had summoned his daughter with a lie, dressed her for a wedding, and stood by the altar while the blade was raised, and whatever came down from heaven in that final instant, his choice had already been made. Perhaps that is the true weight of the story, not what happened to the girl, but what her father proved himself willing to do, and how completely that knowledge changed the one person who could never unknow it. Clytemnestra carried her grief home to Mycenae and tended it there, in silence, unforgiving, through all 10 long years of the war. And when Agamemnon finally came home in triumph from Troy, the debt he had signed on that windless beach was waiting for him at his own door. But that is another story, for another night. If this is the kind of story you want more of, take a moment to subscribe and tell me in the comments which myth I should tell next. Sleep well.